What I want to do is Kathay and I are really going to set the stage for further conversation with regards to innovation. And I want to talk a little bit about, from a global perspective, why innovation is so important. And some of the data that I'm going to present to you is certainly sobering data. It's data that you're probably already familiar with, but I think it is important to refresh our memories associated with that. Number one, we know that agriculture is humanity's largest industry. Worldwide, there are more people involved in agriculture and in food production than in any other industry in any other country. And so agriculture is fundamentally important to the economies, not only of our respective states, but certainly to the countries around the world. And so it's incredibly important. We also know that food security is an issue. We have global food security that's affected by policies. It's affected by political situations. We have national food security that we worry about. But we also have household food security, and household food security is affected directly by poverty. And poverty, oftentimes we are not exposed to the level of poverty that others are exposed to around the world. But when we talk about feeding 9 billion people, and that seems to be a theme and a recurring theme that many of us use, that this is a motivation for doing the kinds of things that we are doing, many of the people that reflect that increase in population aren't coming from developed countries like the United States or Europe. They're coming from developing countries. And many of those countries really don't have the resources necessarily to feed their population. Many of those countries actually are seeing a mass migration of individuals from rural communities into urban communities as well. So they're losing individuals who could actually produce food for them as well. So we've got some really significant challenges, not just here in the United States, but certainly worldwide. And if we think about this globally, that we recognize that we need to understand many of the global challenges. Poverty is the root of household food insecurity. If we take a look at some of the data, around 1 billion people suffer undernutrition or hunger throughout the world. About 1.4 billion live on less than $1.25 per day. 70% of those individuals live in rural communities, and the majority of those individuals obtain their income through farming. 2.6 billion individuals throughout the world live on less than $2 per day. Probably just enough to be able to put food on the table, but then you have to take into consideration the quality of that food as well. Is it just calories, or is it quality calories that they're actually able to afford? And over 2 billion people suffer from nutritional deficiencies. And nutritional deficiencies translates into all sorts of problems in terms of diseases, in terms of all sorts of issues with regards to individuals being able to have enough energy to just get up and work and go to school. If we take a look at the projected population growth, I had indicated that certainly by 2050, they're talking about the population increasing to about 9 billion, or somewhere north of 9 billion people. About 7% of that population growth comes from high-income countries, like the United States and Europe. About 44% of that then comes from low-income countries. And a country like countries in sub-Saharan Africa represent 134% growth. And those are areas that they struggle with water, they struggle with technology, they struggle with the adoption of innovation and just the availability of innovation. And so those are the kinds of things I think that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about innovation, certainly here at home, but how does that translate to a more global population? In terms of food expenditures, I think that it was brought up yesterday by one of the members of the audience during the roundtable discussion that we ought to be considering paying for the real cost of food. In the United States, for food that's consumed in homes, we spend somewhere around 6.5, 6.6% of our expendable income on food. Compare that to the rest of the world. Many countries around the world spend upwards of 40 or 50% of their income on food as well. And so anytime that there are changes as a result of food availability resulting from floods or drought or whatever, it's those that don't have the money that are most susceptible to affordability of food. In terms of arable land, comments that I've heard is that why don't we just put more land into agricultural production? Number one, we're losing land. Here in the United States, we lose land, productive farmland to the tune of about 3,000 acres per day. to urban development. At most, it's estimated that there's about 12% of arable land available worldwide that either isn't forested, isn't subjected to erosion, and isn't subjected to desertification. And so there isn't that much land available. They say that we have to double food production by 2050, but we don't have double the amount of land in order to be able to do that. So it's a real challenge that we're facing. A statistic that was brought up yesterday in the Climate Smart Agriculture session indicated that over 50% of the topsoil of our soils around the world has been lost over the last 150 years. I mean, that's huge. That's productive land that no longer is available in order to produce. So when we talk about innovation, we're talking about taking one step forward and possibly one or two steps backwards. I mean, we have to have innovation in order to be able to accomplish what we want to accomplish in the face of many of these challenges. In terms of water, we know that agriculture uses about 70% of the fresh water worldwide, but we also know with the increase in population from 7 billion to 9 billion or plus, there's going to be competition for that water. There already is here at Colorado and certainly throughout the United States and throughout the world as well. So how are we going to deal with that? And then food waste. Oftentimes when we talk about feeding an ever-increasing population, we talk about increasing food production. But we also need to be looking at the other end of it in food waste. Here in the United States, over 40% of food that's available for human consumption is lost, either through storage, poor handling, consumer disposal, however it might be, we lose quite a bit of food. So that translates to about 20 pounds of food per person per month that's lost as a result of food waste here in the United States. So if we look at all the challenges that we face with regards to agriculture and food production and natural resources and all of the things associated with this, because really what we want to do is to be able to feed this ever-growing population in a sustainable, healthy manner that also preserves and conserves our natural resources for this generation and future generations. We need to take a look at a number of challenges. Certainly population growth is one. Nutrition and health. I think when we talk about food security, we do need to be talking about nutritional security as well. The overall food system, what's involved in that? We're going to be talking about that. I think Kathay and Greg Graff are going to certainly be visiting with you about the value chain analysis, certainly the innovation cluster, but also the entire food system. We need to be thinking about land. We need to be thinking about water. We need to be thinking about energy. The development of biofuels, for instance, and the competition that energy has for water. Again, limited resources. We have all of these competing needs, and how do we address those needs? Looking at the ecosystems, making sure that we don't damage the ecosystems, that we enhance our ecosystems, that we utilize our ecosystems for ecosystem services, for instance. But the utilization of those ecosystems are certainly used for our benefit, but used for everybody's benefit for future generations as well. So we have to protect those ecosystems. We certainly need to be looking at climate, and that was the topic that we had yesterday in terms of climate smart agriculture, and then also international trade. It's also, I think from an international perspective, it's very important to understand the system that we're working in. Just because we can innovate it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be adopted. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. There was a gentleman who I had worked with at Purdue University before coming here. He was a sorghum breeder. He's from Ethiopia, so he knows Ethiopia really well. And he's developed a huge international reputation in terms of sorghum breeding. And as a result of his breeding, it's been estimated he's saved millions of lives as a result of that. But early on in his breeding, he was developing sorghum varieties that had huge amounts of grain production, but they were short-statured. And they could outproduce the native varieties certainly by tenfold increases. And yet they weren't adopted by the local producers. And the reason for that is that the producers actually, not only were they using grain, but they were also using stalks, and they were using a lot of the other material for building houses and using it for fuel. And they didn't want these short-statured varieties. They wanted the tall varieties. And so he went back to the drawing board, and he knew better than this because he was from Ethiopia. But but it's understanding the system that you're working with, making sure that you understand the drivers that influence the decision making that individuals have. Another one is golden rice, and many of you have probably, you're familiar with golden rice, and golden rice was going to be the panacea for saving millions of individuals from vitamin A deficiencies. Certainly early on, there were issues with its adoption, and even today there are issues with its adoption. Some of it has to do with the GMO base. Some of it has to do with the fact that it's a golden color, and the consumers just don't want to eat rice that looks golden. And so these are the kinds of things that unless you understand the system that you're working in, you're not necessarily going to see the immediate or future adoption of the innovation. And these are huge innovative kinds of things that have occurred. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Norman Borlaug. And this is one that I typically have in my slide presentation about hunger. And I'll quote him. He says, "You can't build a peaceful world on empty stomachs and human misery." And so the first thing that has to occur is to make sure that we have food in people's stomachs, make sure that it's nutritious food, and develop innovative ways of developing that food, getting it to the people, making sure that they have that accessible as well. Before I introduce Kathay, I'm also going to share with you Lou Swanson and I, Raj Khosla, and Alan Rudolph just came back from an international meeting in Abu Dhabi. It was the Global Forum for Innovation in Agriculture. So this is only their second year for doing this. This is our first year for doing this here. This is a topic that is gaining a tremendous amount of steam worldwide, and that is the international conference dealing with innovation in agriculture. We are also one of 2 universities that are knowledge partners with that organization. Raj Khosla, one of our faculty, gave a keynote presentation while we were there as well. Leaders from many countries around the world gathered to talk about this whole crisis dealing with agriculture and how do we infuse innovation in agriculture. So we're very excited about that. We also are members of the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, and we're a founding member of that. And that is a number of countries around the world who are participating in that as well. We're one of the few universities that are associated with that, certainly here in the United States. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I'm going to introduce Kathay Rennels. Kathay is the Associate Vice President for Engagement, and she's going to set the stage with regards to the concept of the value chain, ag value chain, and then the ag innovation study. Kathay?
Thanks, Greg. Thank you. Okay, so everybody jump up and get coffee. This is a good time. So good morning, first of all. I also want to welcome Mayor Hancock, who has just come in the room. Wave your hand, Michael. There you are over there. Thank you so much. I have a light in my eyes, and we have the lights over here on the windows are at their darkest level right now. They'll change, which is a beautiful part of the new Laurie Center. So I'm Kathay Rennels, and I'm here to tell you how you got here. So I am the translator, if you will, and Tony, thank you for the kind words. I am not an academic that actually is a scholar of the land grant system. I am a consumer of the land grant system. I grew up on a ranch in Franktown, Colorado. We raised beef and we raised hay. And I am, from yesterday, and I'm taking this kindly, several references to the graying population of agriculture. Did you hear that, Mr. Mativi, yesterday? You heard that, yeah. Yeah, several people referenced one of the challenges is the graying population of agriculture. I am the graying population of agriculture. I was raised in Franktown on a ranch where agriculture was life and felt very powerful in that. And I knew that that was life. And then I am a nomadic in my job career, if you will, from Franktown moving into a political career where as a county commissioner for 12 years and then president of Colorado counties, recognizing where you begin to see splits. You begin to recognize where people are not understanding. And no longer was agriculture an assumed issue. It began to be very quizzical in people's mind. How do you do it? Decisions in land use planning do not take into account how water runs and how agriculture corridors actually work. You don't have that opportunity. As you do that, I had an opportunity when I was leaving the commission here at Larimer County to come to Colorado State University, and I will tell you my journey has been guided and directed by someone besides myself, because from there, the year that I came here, Governor Hickenlooper was elected. And they asked me to go on his tour of the Blueprint Tour because I spoke county commissioner. Not that the state, Fiona, doesn't speak county commissioner, but they needed somebody who spoke county commissioner. Our resource to get people there was our Colorado State Extension Service. They hit their Rolodex of integrity and trusted partners, and people turned out. The journey that got us here is that in the 30th county, which was Center, Colorado, I was sitting there with a lady named Darlene Scott, whose husband Steve Scott, and they farm in Burlington, Colorado. As we're sitting there in 30 counties, we said, do you know that agriculture hasn't been mentioned first once as an economic driver on this tour? And water has been mentioned once as an issue. Now that's startling, and it's also very frightening. So how do you figure out where to go with that? There's a whole journey which I won't bore you with, but the beauty then is that life had put me in a higher education system that could come back and find the research to answer that question. So I met with a young man named Greg Graff, and I said, we need a study of the entire agricultural system. So it's not just cows and it's not just corn, it's the system that runs the world. He was pretty young and I think a little stupid at the time and didn't really understand. He did not understand me because he said, how hard can that be? I'm like, I don't know, you're the economist, let's figure this out. If you look at the NAICS codes that actually identify industries, I think people would pull up maybe 20. They would pull up corn, wheat, beef, you might pull up 20. We had to stop at 220. It kept growing. So from yesterday, one thing you heard at the round table was, we are a linkages of businesses, if you will. And so the agriculture value chain was born out of that theory. The slide on the wall is the agriculture value chain, and I'm going to give Greg an opportunity to walk you through that. One of the things from that came a very clear picture that in northern Colorado and along the I-25 corridor, we have an innovation cluster put here, and Greg will tell you the story of how they got here, but we literally have a research corridor here that grew organically. It grew by itself and probably grew because nobody saw it, so they couldn't screw it up. So as we begin to look at that, one of the core objectives for the governor was innovation, and we sit in the middle of it. And Colorado State University is the second largest patentor of intellectual property in the state of Colorado. So the opportunity to really bring this forward came from a grant from Chancellor Martin that gave us a chance to do the innovation study. With that, partnered with the Colorado Office of Innovation, and having Craig stand up at one of the president's meetings and saying, we should have a small summit around this. Welcome to our small summit, and I'd like to introduce my partner, Greg Graff.